Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for the first two clusters of our colloquium. And now I am indeed honored and very much pleased to introduce Professor Roland Clark from the University of Liverpool. Professor Clark, I met Professor Clark when he was a PhD candidate almost a quarter of a century ago at New Europe College. Perhaps some of you know very well that he's an author of our Romanian journal Arheus Studies in the History of Religions with a very bright essay on Leo Shestov. Professor Clark is very well known among the Romanian studies scholars who traveled from his native Australia in the University of Sydney, where he studied with one of the best Religionswissenschaftler in the world, Karol Kasak, and then to Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh, where he studied with Professor Irina Livezeanu, and now he's a full professor of modern history at the University of Liverpool. You know, of course, I assume, his excellent book, Holy Legionary Youth, which was published in 2015 in both Columbia and Polyrom, so in New York and Iași, București. I admire very much his proficiency in reading, understanding, and speaking Romanian. He is one of us. He is a gift to the Romanian culture. And you know, after his 2023 book on the religious dissensions in the early interwar period in Romania, 1920s, he's preparing a book on the phenomenon of Maglavit. So we would like to warmly introduce Professor Clark, and please give him our applause.
Thank you very much, Eugene. So today I'd like to talk about The Shepherd of Maglavit. This is a book that, with a bit of luck, will be sent to out for peer review this afternoon. I have about 800 words left to write, and then I can send it off and not think about it again for a couple of months. It's a book I've been working on for a long time, and really my 2021 book on the 1920s church history was accidentally written while I was trying to research this one. So I'll come back to that. On Friday, the 31st of May, 1935, an estimated 30,000 people died in an earthquake in British India. A ballerina fell out of her upstairs window after seeing a ghost. And God appeared to a shepherd in a small village on the Danube River. The shepherd said, "I met him at the stump. This is the sort of man he was. This big, with a white beard, broad, big whiskers, and his cheeks covered with hair. His eyes were big, as blue as the sky. His hair flowed down to his legs. Of his feet you could only see the toenails. His white hair was like silk. His hair gave off a powerful, beautiful smell. He said, 'Don't be afraid, for I will give you courage, and I'll tell you something.' As you probably know, tens of thousands of people descended on the village looking for healing and hoping to see something spectacular. We have journalists, photographers, theologians, bishops, doctors, public health officials, politicians and businessmen jostled to give their opinions about whether Lupu was telling the truth and on whether having so many sick peasants gathered in one place without anywhere good to live and with no public toilet was a business opportunity or a potential health crisis. God very quickly fades into the background as interest in the shepherd's life and in what the phenomenon means about rural Romania captures the public imagination. When I first visited Maglavit, I had my 4-year-old daughter with me, and we'd just spent a week at the beach, and her skin was covered in this rash that was either caused by, I think, the sunscreen or the fact that she became addicted to Kashkaval pane, which can't be good for anyone. The Mother Superior of Maglavit Monastery kindly gave her some holy water from a well located at the site where Petrache Lupu had his visions. The water is known to be holy, and we were thrilled to see that her rash cleared up the very next day. But the day that she drank the holy water was the same day we started putting on a topical cream that we found at the doctor's. So it's difficult to know, was it the water from the well or was it the cream that healed her? Theologically, it probably doesn't matter because God works through Western medicine as often as folk remedies, and the ambiguity is part of the mystery that surrounds the Christian God. The sacred, as you know, poses an almost insoluble problem for the historian. If I can sit next to someone and not know what's going through their head or their heart while they're praying, how can I find out and make a decision about what's happening 90 years ago in a village that's very, very different from Liverpool? I have no intention of either exposing or confirming Lupu's visions. There's nothing unusual in people having visions, and you can find visionaries in almost every major religious tradition and in societies around the globe. There's also a significant difference between Lupu's account and psychotic hallucinations. Psychiatrists say that if you have hallucinations, they're frequent, extended, and distressing. They're usually auditory, and they're often accompanied by strange fixed beliefs or delusions not shared by other people. So just because Lupu had visions doesn't mean he was crazy. Whether he's a charlatan or not, that's your problem to work out. What I'm interested in is working out what rural people in the 1930s thought about modernity. Did they see it as a world where God had been pushed to the margins? Was the future about cities and factories, or did peasants still matter? Did Western medicine and science offer the best solutions to their problems? Even if we can't test whether Lupu's religious experience was real, the way that people reacted to his visions tells us a lot about what life was like and how people thought and believed in the 1930s. Most of our knowledge about rural Eastern Europe comes from the writings of politicians and doctors and sociologists and journalists talking about peasants, and not from the peasants themselves. But with Petrache Lupu, we have this amazing source base where we can hear peasant voices and let them tell us in their own words about things that were important to them. The problem is that peasant voice sources about religion aren't as straightforward as I would have liked. And what I want to do today is to unpack this particular pamphlet. It's written by Father Nikolai Bobin, who is the priest at Maglavit, and it's one of the first accounts, first published accounts we have of the visions. For people that want a little bit of methodology, the three main approaches that I'm drawing on today, one is Michal Bakhtin, and looking at the way that he reads between the lines and looks for polyphony in sources. Another one is Valerie Hobbs' Introduction to Religious Language, and she looks at the way that people use religious language when they're not necessarily talking about religious things. And finally, Robert Alter's The Art of Biblical Narrative, and the way that scholars of the Old Testament in particular try to interpret sources of prophecy and biblical books. And I'm using those three methodologies on this pamphlet that we have from Maglavit. So just to tell you what happens in the pamphlet, it starts when an old man appears to Lupu on his way to work. He says, "This old man, when he crossed my path, asked me where I was going. I got scared and started to tremble with fear. He said, 'Don't be afraid, because I'm going to give you courage. Look, I'll tell you something.' Then I wasn't afraid anymore, and I said, 'Okay, old man, tell me.' He said, 'Go and tell everyone, the priest, the town hall, the church, that if they don't stop, if they don't celebrate the holidays, if they don't stop doing evil, if they don't come to church, if they don't, then it is coming. The fire is coming. Then all our work will be ruined. These are the words, and I've tried to relate them exactly as the shepherd said them. After this, the old man, the moshul, he calls him, moshul disappeared above in a square, glowing cloud that took him up until I couldn't see him anymore. I bowed down and I went to the sheep pen, wondering at what had happened to me. When I got there, I didn't tell anyone anything so that I wouldn't become a laughingstock. So Lupu doesn't pass the message on immediately, and when Moshu appears a week later, he says, "Please forgive me, I forgot." Even though he'd really obviously disobeyed, Lupu says that when he met Moshu for the second time, I wasn't scared anymore because now I knew him. And it takes 3 visions before Lupu's ready to tell other people, and when he does, it's in church on a Sunday morning. Lupu stood up beside the priest at the end of the service, and when he began to speak, the old man appeared and told him what to say. Father Nikolai Bobbin, the priest in Maglavit, he immediately acknowledges Lupu's visions and sets about promoting him as a messenger from God. Bobbin asks him a whole heap of questions, and, for example, Lupu doesn't know what the old man smelt like, and so he takes him around the house and he gives him various things to smell. And when he finds myrrh, he says, that's exactly what it is. After everyone had heard the message, Lupu says he went back to the sheep pen, and then a great and shining star appeared in the shape of a rhombus, about 60 to 70 centimeters. This shape appeared in front of me horizontally above the ground. The inside of the shape of the star was lit up by a light at its center. The edges of the star were as blue as the sky. In each quarter was rain, wind, fire, and coals. When I looked up about an arm's length above me, I saw the same old man who appeared at other times with no differences. He explained all the signs from the figure to me, and then he taught me the following. He said to put my hand on the star, and then when I wanted to grab it, it flew up over my head and I couldn't reach it. The old man did this 3 times, and he told me, I'm going to show you this sign again, this autumn or the next, when you will be in the village in the middle of a crowd of people. If the people repent before then, I'll make the sign of the cross together with this star, a sign of blessing and forgiveness. If the people don't repent, then I'll leave this star in front of you and of the people, and I'll keep it very low. Then you will call the people and have them put their hands on it. It will rise up and they won't be able to catch it anymore. You'll do this 2 more times, 3 times in all. After this, you'll tell the people to prepare themselves because ruin is coming. Then the star will explode and the wind will spread fire and rain across the whole earth. Finally, at the end of the story, Lupu says, I left for the sheep pen about 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. That's the 8th of August, 1935. In the forest, before I got to the cross, while I was on the path, there appears on my right, floating in the air above the trees, something that looked like a man, but completely black and ugly, with a nose that was long and crooked. I think it was the devil. He said to me, What did you do to me that I'm left with fewer bad people? I answered, It wasn't me, it was God. Then I kept going, but he kept floating above the trees, and he said to me again, Who is this God? When we got close to the cross, a cloud appeared from the sky. The old man was standing on a small mound in the middle of the cloud. Around him were 11 people, men dressed in white, some of whom were on their knees and others standing. Next to him was a woman who was praying on her knees. Then the old man asked me why I kept calling him Moshul. Don't you know that I'm God? I said I didn't know because you hadn't told me. Behold, I am God who has come to earth. Be aware that I don't want to see you become rich. Keep telling everyone what I commanded you, and don't be afraid, because I will look after those who don't believe and those who want to do you harm. You know that the devil was going to kill you? Then I saw how God threw a small round object at the devil. It's about 12 to 15 centimeters in diameter. The object was made of fire, like a big ball. In the middle was a cross, and on the outside it was sparkling blue. When the object hit him, the devil disintegrated. Then I asked who the woman is, and God said that it is the Virgin Mary, and she prays continually for the forgiveness of the sins of the world. God lifted his hands from us, and the Virgin leads us now, and prays constantly for us to be forgiven. After this, God disappeared above, and I, the shepherd, kept going to the sheep pen. So that's the story. What do we make of this? As a as a person who lives in the 21st century, I don't think that Petrache's story would inspire a mass pilgrimage. It doesn't feel right. Lupu seems too laid back. He's too blasé when he finds himself face to face with the creator of heaven and earth. Dimitri Stindaway says this is the only time in any story about mystics or theophany that he's ever heard where someone is so relaxed. God appears 3 times. It just seems too neat, too much like a folk tale. The shepherd, as he tries to catch the star, which keeps flying just out of his reach, it seems childish and playful. Lupu's audience believes too quickly, even before the miracles start to happen. The pamphlet misses out key details, such as the fact that an unseasonal and massive hailstorm had destroyed the entire harvest at Maglavit a week before this happened, or the eye-watering amounts of money that suddenly become flooding into Maglavit. The fact that it's not mentioned by the man who's administering all that money is a bit telling. The old man's identity is too ambiguous for me. Is this Jesus? And if it is, why does he look so old? Maybe it's God the Father, but John's Gospel tells us that no one has ever seen God. So wouldn't that be heretical? Lupu's attitude, it's not the way that the Orthodox Church would have us relate to God. If you look at the liturgy, it describes God as one whose domain is incomparable and glory incomprehensible, whose mercy is immeasurable and love for mankind ineffable, and who has established the orders and hosts of angels and archangels in heaven to minister to his glory. During a typical church service, the liturgy spends over an hour emphasizing God's power and how unworthy humanity is. Whenever the gospel's read, the congregation kneels as a sign of respect towards its exalted content and its divine author. Worshippers cross themselves over 20 times in any given church service, including every time the priest mentions the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's just hard to reconcile that level of awe and majesty with the old man that Lupu relates to in so relaxed a manner. Petrache Lupu's God is also quite different to the gods of other peasant visionaries. Other peasants, when they talk about God, they often do so in ways that echo the book of Revelation. For example, we have a vision by Ion Popa Gheorghe from 1918, and he's led through by the Archangel Michael through various heavenly toll booths until he reaches the throne of God, and then he falls down and worships. That's the way that I would have thought that Petrache Lupu should have seen God. But that we have Gheorghe's vision because it's written down by a spiritualist, and no one was impressed. So why Petrache Lupu's vision? Why does that impress people in ways that the guy going to heaven with Archangel Michael doesn't? In 1930, a team of Gusti sociologists, they travel up to a village in the Făgăraș Mountains, to Draguș, and they ask about peasant beliefs, hoping to show that religion underpins all economic and social relationships in the village. And while they're there, they meet a guy named Nicodem Codrea, and he told them this vision. God was clothed in shining white light, and Jesus Christ in white. God raised me up to heaven, and I saw the veil pass before Jesus Christ with snakes behind him. I followed Jesus, the Son of the God, the Heavenly Father. He gave me reins, and I put them on the head of the snake and secured the rest of his body. And before I could count to 10, the Lord Jesus Christ took them and threw them down from heaven into the darkness. Nicodem tells the truth. The vision goes on in this vein, and Codrea, he emphasizes the power of God and the mystery that he would choose to reveal himself to us through his Son. Again, Codrea's dream is not published until the sociologists find it 10 years later, and it attracts almost no public attention, even though it's much more theologically sophisticated than Lupu. Lupu's concerns were much more immediate and very practical, and there's almost no reflection on justice or the ultimate destruction of evil, whereas visions like Codrea's apparently weren't seen as anything particularly remarkable. if you look at other visions, sometimes they had political implications. So in the mid-1920s, peasants in Moldova and Bukovina become embroiled in disputes over plans to change the church calendar to bring it in line with the Western one that was being used by the Romanian state. And changing the calendar was unpopular, partly because the rationale for the changes had been badly explained. One article imagines a fictitious peasant who, when he's told by the calendar reform by his parish priest, says, well, if it changes here in the village, we'll kill the mayor first. Everything functions in accordance with the old calendar, they said. Like the cuckoo doesn't sing on Annunciation with the new calendar. It sings with the old calendar. When has the cuckoo always sung? He sings until midsummer. Now midsummer passes and he's still singing. The soil follows the old calendar too. No one sows on the new first day of March, but the old first day of March is perfect. And there's a lot of itinerant monks who are encouraging the peasants not to accept the new calendar, and they form a new religious community called Old Calendarism, or Stilisti. They build their own churches, they rebaptize their children, they insult priests and gendarmes, and they occasionally clash with the authorities in bloody battles when the police try to stop them worshipping. One of their leaders is Glicaria Tenace, who police persecuted particularly brutally. His followers reported seeing him accompanied by a guardian angel who looked like a man dressed in white with a belt around his middle and bare foot, who produced light around him. Tenace also said that he saw a vision of the Virgin Mary, and people are like, oh, you're just trying to be like Petrache Lupu. And this pamphlet that you see here, it calls him Rasputino Moldove and tries to discredit his vision. Tenace's visions for the old calendarists reinforce his reputation as a holy man, and by extension encourages them to keep fighting for the old calendar. In 1935, God appears to a young girl in another old calendarist village, and he tells her to keep celebrating religious holidays according to the old calendar, reassuring the community that he's on their side. Once Petrache Lupu has his visions, the old calendarists go to him and say, what does Moshel say? Should we worship according to the old calendar? And he's like, who are you? You're a peasant. That's not our job to work stuff out. Go and listen to your priest. Do whatever he says. The only vision that comes close to Petrache Lupu's that I've been able to dig up comes from a cowherd, Benica Dolianu, in 1938. His God, he says, was an old man with a white beard and locks, and appeared at a time when the area was suffering from a drought. God shows himself to Dolianu when he was out watching the cows, and asked to speak to the village priest. When he comes back a second time, first in the form of a dove and then as an old man, God asked Dolianu whether he told the priest about the vision. Dolianu said, yes, I went straight away. But God knew the cowherd had only been to the edge of the village and returned, so he rebuked him. And the second time, Dolianu does report his vision to the priest, but the priest didn't believe him. But then others do start to believe when the heavenly dove appears to them too, coming down close, and then flying away before they could catch it. Then a fireball appears in the sky and is seen by many people before crashing to earth. God warns Dolianu that the Antichrist had come and would soon appear to tempt him. Not long after, when Dolianu was again out with the cows, a strong man appeared before me with many good things, clothes, food, money. Knowing that this was the Antichrist, Dolianu makes the sign of the cross 3 times, and the man disappeared in a cloud of smoke, together with all the tempting gifts. The villagers, they put up a cross and a small chapel on the side of the vision, and Dolianu is put in charge of looking after the lamp, which was kept burning before the icons. One day when he's tending the lamp, a young man appears before him, bleeding from his hands and his feet, but glowing with a supernatural light. Dolianu immediately recognized him as Jesus, who told him only to light the lamp on Sundays and holidays. And Jesus says, for only those who are weak in their faith come here to look. They don't bring any oil with them for the candle. They only use the oil that's already here. Thus, only a few people will be saved, because true faith in God has been lost, and people have become lovers of gluttony and idleness, out of which all evil comes. You probably recognize Dolianu. His vision has several features that we see at Maglavit. God's an old man with a white beard. He comes back 3 times. The visionary doesn't want to tell the priest. There's fireballs in the sky. God's enemies appear afterwards. And there's complaints about a widespread lack of faith. Like Petrache Lupu, Dolianu is also taken seriously by the church. His story is written up by a monk. It's printed in a monastery. The site becomes a minor destination for pilgrims, just apparently not any pilgrim who cared enough to bring their own oil. So why, with a cowherd and a shepherd, whose stories are theologically unsophisticated, politically irrelevant, and honestly not very likely, taken more seriously than the other visionaries, whose accounts better fitted with what the church taught? The miraculous healings are crucial for securing Petrache Lupu as an international figure. But it also matters, I think, that the stories are told in a way that sounds something like what people thought would happen to a shepherd. Romanians in the 1930s had quite clear ideas about a shepherd. The Miorița, it revolves around a shepherd who's warned of his impending death by a lamb. The news that Jesus is born is revealed to shepherds. In the Bible, you have Abraham, Jacob, Moses, King David, and the prophet Amos are all shepherds. As people who spend most of their time in isolated places, it's common knowledge that shepherds had unusual experiences. It was a shepherd who found a woman who'd been beaten and raped in a field near Constanța in August 1928. His discovery took place in the same week that another shepherd was caught raping a sheep in the fields near Bacău. In 1924, 2 shepherds were tied up by bandits who stole their entire flock. A shepherd was shot dead by a soldier who led his sheep across a firing range. Another was shot while trying to steal melons in the middle of the night. And another was run over by a speeding train when he sat down on the tracks to lace up his boots. Newspaper editors, they print these sorts of stories not only for their shock value, but also because shepherds were seen as somewhat exotic individuals, and their experiences are larger than life and they're worth telling stories about. You also tell stories about God. We have the field notes of students who were sent to do ethnographic interviews with elderly people in villages around Maglavit, and they come up with a remarkable range of narratives, ranging from folk tales to detailed theological explanations of the world. And I like them because these sources, they're largely unmediated. The students don't know the theory that they're trying to tease out of the peasants, and we don't have any. We don't have a sociologist then coming in and trying to interpret them for us, and so we just get the words of the old people. The problem is it's difficult to tell whether these informants were telling the young people what they themselves thought or just anecdotes they'd heard. But as with most things, it's probably a bit of both. Folk tales are usually prefaced by some sort of once upon a time, emphasizing the narrator doesn't actually believe what the story was true. In these tales, however, the peasants just answer the questions as if they're explaining scientific truth, because the student comes up and says, "Tell me what you know about God." And one woman from Lăcrița, she tells the student, God appears first and foremost as a man with a long white beard and eyebrows to match. He always sits on a golden throne. Angels dressed as soldiers stand alongside him as bodyguards. He has a great book on his knees in which he writes down everyone's deeds. Almost identical descriptions of God as an old man with a long white beard are recorded by students in Barca, Negoiești, and Siliștea Cruci, all villages quite close to Maglavit. So Petrache Lupu is obviously not the only person who imagines God as an old man. When asked about Jesus, people said he was the Son of God, but then they don't go into much details about what he looked like. In these interviews, God comes across as somewhat impulsive and arbitrary. he creates humans because, to quote, he needed helpers while he was creating the world. One woman from Godin says that in the beginning, heaven was very close to the earth, but an old woman who was washing the baby's nappies wiped all the dirt onto heaven. God becomes upset and raised heaven higher so that no one can touch it anymore. God's also wise, but his actions don't always make sense at first glance. We have the story of a 94-year-old man from Plenica who tells us, when the wife of Father Christmas served as the midwife to the Virgin Mary, God cut off her hands. Later, he told her to wash her hands in my pool so that she will grow hands of gold and silver. So what seemed like a harsh thing to do turns out to be a blessing, provided you want hands made of gold and silver. The same man also described the Virgin Mary as the daughter of Father Christmas. And he says that the Jews hated Jesus because Jesus knew how to do the sign of the cross even when he was a child. So I don't know what I think about this old man. Is he just demented, or a bit muddled? But he's nonetheless expressing a coherent theology in which God interferes directly in people's affairs, but he does so in inexplicable ways, expecting people to trust and obey him without knowing why. As tempting as it is, we can't take these interviews as evidence of sort of what peasants believed. The students who are writing them down appear to have found these stories exotic, even though they'd grown up in these same villages. The internal logic within the folk tales is quite consistent, though, and even when people like the old guy get mixed up about the details, they agree about the way the characters are supposed to behave. They're lessons about how the world works, rather than dogmatic statements about metaphysics. God comes across as someone who has the last word on everything and whose will cannot be ignored. God's a free spirit. He doesn't have to obey the same rules as everyone else. In the words of one popular saying, the world has its problems because that's the way it is when God has no master. Often it's God's impulsiveness that helps to drive the plot. One of these informants says, it seems that this God only sends bad things when he sees that everything's going well. God and other biblical characters in these stories, they inhabit the same world as the storytellers, and the stories happen in villages and forests very much like those of modern Romania. The characters talk to God just like they talk to other people, even though they admit that God deserves better. And this is where other folk tales can be helpful. For example, you might know Costache Negruți's story Todorica, where Jesus and the apostles, they visit the peasant Todorica and he gives them cheap wine, but otherwise he's quite a decent host. And Jesus says, thank you, I'll give you 3 wishes. And Todorica wastes his wishes on cheap tricks to make sure that he'll always win playing cards. And the apostle Peter, he's horrified at the fact that Todorica just doesn't care about holy things. And he says he should be wishing for his salvation. But Todorica ignores him. And then he uses his luck at cards to trick the devil and to secure himself a place in heaven. Peasants, they might be ignorant, but they're also clever, and they can trick even the most powerful of beings. The other thing to say is that none of these characters in these stories meet God because of any particular virtue of their own. Negruți writes that Todorica was handsome and kind-hearted, but as debauched as it's possible to be. He loved cards, wine, and women. He hadn't been to confession since he was a child, and he went to church only to stare at the pretty girls. So I have a theory that Petrache Lupu's story sounds convincing because this is a genre of storytelling that rural people were comfortable with. God and the shepherd both behave just as one might have expected them to. And apart from the fact that this happens on a specific time and place, it could have come straight out of any number of folk tales. Other supernatural beings who appear in the students' interviews also would have been at home in Lupu's story. Lightning, for example, according to the interviews, was said to be the whip Elijah uses in his right hand to strike demons. Hailstorms, like the one that had devastated Maglavit just a week before God appears in the first vision, they're caused by evil spirits. If you work on the Thursday after Easter, then it was likely to hail twice before St. Elijah's Day. And the only way to prevent hail was to stick a knife in the ground, and the evil spirit would be afraid of getting cut and would run away. Unclean spirits were known to call out to people at night, and they disfigure people who work on religious holidays. Lupu's devil, he fits the descriptions of the devil that we find from people in this area. One woman tells the students, the devil takes the form of men and animals and wanders the earth among people. And another explains that he's black, has horns like a goat, a tail. He transforms into a cat, a man, a goat. And the devil's treachery, it's never deadly in folk tales. And he's always outwitted either by the hero or by another supernatural being. In one folk tale, the devil appears as a man with red hair, and he enslaves an emperor's son through a cruel trick. But the son's goodness causes all the animals to help him. And eventually he defeats his new master and marries the daughter of a neighboring emperor. At the same time that the peasants are comfortable telling and retelling accounts of supernatural encounters through folk tales, city dwellers found that Petrache Lupu fit their ideas about peasants. Most people in the 1930s had in fact grown up in villages, although sociologists were saying that they were losing the mentality of peasants in that they no longer wore traditional folk costumes and didn't go to church anymore. Even people that in the cities who had no recent memory of village life would have heard the folk tales and read them in newspapers, magazines, or children's books. And also, many urban intellectuals are believing wholeheartedly that the peasantry is the foundation of the Romanian nation, and they quite quickly convinced themselves that folk tales were genuinely a reflection of the way that peasants really thought. Philosophers wrote constantly about peasants as representatives of Romanianness. Constantin Rădălescu-Motru has a lengthy treatise on the psychology of the Romanian people, and he says that all Romanians are peasants at heart. Romanians are natural anarchists because they want to be masters of their own property. They're deeply afraid of individual initiative. They're conservative, long-suffering, but quick to give up when they start things, and they're committed to do things the way they've always done. Lucian Blaga, he builds an entire philosophical system on a really idiosyncratic analysis of folk tales. Rădălescu-Motru is born into a wealthy family with a long history of higher learning, but Blaga grew up as the son of a village priest, and he used to write that because of his childhood memories, the village lives inside me like in a palpable way, as living experience. The village is a spiritual place, Blaga said, that could only be properly understood through the eyes of a child. I quote, childhood seems to me to be the only way into the metaphysics of the village, to that which is strange and natural at the same time, metaphysical, alive, hidden in hearts which beat under roofs of straw and in faces haunted by fate, but with eyes turned up to the heavens. So if you can take Lucian Blaga seriously, or if someone from București in 1930 can take Blaga seriously, it's not that big a stretch to take Petrache Lupu seriously, because they're both talking about this exoticized, mystical, folktale style village. One of Blaga's friends, Nikifor Krajnic, he takes the idea that peasant culture represented Romanianness and he weaponizes it against liberal intellectuals who we call the Europeanists. Krajnic becomes a fascist during the 1930s, but in the 20s he was better known as the editor of Gândirea, which he used to promote cultural politics that celebrates folk culture, and he rejected anything that he didn't like by saying, oh, that's foreign. Listening to Krajnic, one would think that the Romanians had invented Christianity. There's a strong correlation between the atmosphere of the Gospels and our atmosphere, he says, between the Gospels' landscape and ours, between their spirit and our popular wisdom. There are scenes and events from the life of Jesus that seem like they happen here among us. And there are parables, all the parables really, which seem like they were conceived among us. It's as if the teacher, when he preached beneath the soft blue sky, looked out over a ploughman sowing his seeds, over a sheep pen, a trout trawler on the Danube, or a hill covered in vineyards. and the essence of his golden wisdom decked out in parables seems like it was addressed directly to this people, which loves proverbs and poetry. And Kleinik, when he gets to Maglavit, he says, this is the same mysticism as of the old religious books whose eschatological vision steered our people in fearful awe toward the shores of another life. But when he's there, he finds it not very mystical, and he finds it a really not very spiritual place. But his conclusion then is that if God appeared to someone so uneducated and so stupid as Petrache Lupu, obviously it was real. And he gets that idea from Lupu himself. Kleinik says that Lupu, when he was there, preached that if the old man had appeared to someone with education like you are, and that man had told everyone what I say, people wouldn't have believed him, because people would have said, what he's saying comes from him, not from God. But this way, the old man appeared to an ignorant shepherd like me. Everyone knows that I'm a stupid shepherd, and everyone knows that what I say doesn't come from me, but from God, and people believe. Kleinik's convinced that God would appear to a shepherd like Lupu because it fits with his ideas about Romanianness and Christianity. But it's also helpful to look to someone like Victor Eftemiou, who says that Lupu reminded him of characters that appeared in his own stories. Eftemiou is a prolific playwright and poet who was quite famous for his folk tales and children's stories. And he has a unique ability to find unexpected and original interpretations of well-known characters. But unlike most people, Eftemiou's stories, they don't glorify the Romanian nation. So it's not just a Romanian nationalist talking crap. For example, during the First World War, he said, I don't have to fight for Romania because I'm part Ottoman. And then when Romania enters the war, he goes to Paris and he says that he tells the French that laziness was a Romanian national characteristic, which is why it had taken them 2 years to enter World War I. And he doesn't, when he meets Petrache Lupu in 1939, he doesn't portray him as a hero. He says Lupu's house smelt of sheepskin and spoiled milk, with new gilded edges decorating the thin paper icons. Petrache Lupu's mind, instincts, and way of talking are those of a 5 or 6 year old boy. He has a thoughtful forehead, black eyebrows joined together, handsome eyes, a thin nose, long fingers on his hands, small bones. The progeny of some minor nobleman? Maybe. His physiognomy is more refined than that of a normal shepherd. He has what one might call breeding. His upper teeth grow inwards, getting smaller as they finish in a triangle. Evidence of degeneration? Maybe. And Eftemiou quite liked Lupu, the cynicism that he has about his role. And Lupu is constantly making these side comments to Eftemiou about, oh, look, the priests are making money off me. But he says, I thought it was Ion, the madman from Caragiale's misfortune, who sees the Virgin Mary and the squirrel. But he's also Agamitsa Dandanake, shorter, better looking, less harsh than he looks in the photographs. This little shepherd seemed familiar to me, as if I knew him from my stories. He's the man who speaks with God in the miracle of Saint Elijah. He's Ionica the idiot, who learns how to build a bridge up to heaven. He's Florin from Floriana and Florin. He's Ispas from the Church of the Unnamed Saints, who carves flutes and paints icons in praise of unknown disciples. He's the little child who gives the nobleman a flute from elderberry for the Argeș monastery in Mește Manole. These are not compliments. Many of these characters are stupid and simplistic and manipulated by those around them, but they're also full of luck. And luck governs their fates. When they're not being cursed by fantastical beings, they're receiving magical revelations or divine objects from them. Their job is to keep moving forward, not to shy away from dangers, and not to be intimidated by people with power. In return, they're rewarded with untold riches. And very importantly, riches never change them. And they remain the same innocent and steadfast people that they were at the beginning. And I'm going to jump a little bit through some of the things that Petrache Lupu talks about, but they're all stuff that people at the time cared about, like people abandoning babies in fields, or fights between villages. He says, I told them not to lie, not to make enemies, not to steal, not to sleep around, to respect their parents and old people, to keep the Wednesday and Friday fast, and not to do things that are evil in the eyes of people and of God. And then he says, children shouldn't laugh at their elders. No one should laugh at his brother. Stop stealing, stop quarreling. Don't go and steal the corn from the poor. Don't swear, don't fight, don't set fires, don't quarrel and feud. And that's quite different, actually, to what the church was obsessed about at the time. He never mentions sectarians, and he never mentions alcohol, which are the two things that most sermons are constantly going on about in the 1930s. Lupu focuses on issues that mattered in Maglavit. The old man warns Lupu's listeners about divisions in the village, including crime and rivalries and jealousies. Discord's a problem that has a long history in Maglavit. That's the next chapter after this one that I've just shown you. But my point is today simply to try and do a careful reading of this source and to show how genre and structure matter a lot when reading peasant sources and help us to understand why Petrache Lupu might have been successful when other prophets weren't. So thank you very much for your attention, and any questions or suggestions, I would really love to hear them.
Thank you so much, dear Roland. Please, if you would like to address some questions to Professor Clark from the audience here in Bucharest to the Merseyside dimension of the Romanian history of religions. I first of all would like to congratulate for this keynote lecture of our workshop. It was splendid because it combines all the elements of proper research, first and foremost, and your character, our character, Petrache Lupu, and his other colleagues, peasants, shepherds, priests, are all somehow related to not only lived religion, but also to all the characteristics of modern Romania, politically, culturally, etc. What was splendid in your presentation, I think, was this perception that through Petrache Lupu and Maglavit and all the context, you can see way beyond all the cultural and religious, theological and newspapers of that period. We are indeed celebrating, so to say, 80 years from the first vision, as you mentioned in your first phrase. So Petrache Lupu was not only an exceptional appearance at that moment, it was moreover a mirror of the entire Romanian and even beyond society. So my after your lecture, I am very much interested in knowing more about the structure of your monograph on your Maglavit monograph, because I do think if you will research all these Romanian and European sources within the framework of a monograph, 200-300 pages, you may have already one of the finest samples of religious history of interwar Romania. So if you can please tell us a bit more about the structure of your future book. And thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. So the book starts off, I translate the pamphlet, and then you heard a chapter that I called storytelling, and that looks at structure and genre and the importance of why he told the story in the way that he did and how that was convincing to people. And then we go into the modern village and we talk about what life was like in Maglavit in the 20 or 30 years before and during Petrache Lupu. We start really with the 1907 Peasant Rebellion, which is the year Petrache Lupu was born. And we try to say what mattered to peasants. And then we look at the pilgrimage and the healings and situate that in terms of why do peasants go to faith healers rather than doctors. And then the doctors come in a chapter called Investigating Lupu. And I talk about Ion Milhăcescu and Dumitru Stăniloae and the theologians and their interpretation of him, and then various psychiatrists. And why would someone like George Marinescu, who's one of the leading psychiatrists or neuropsychologists of his day, why would he say that Petrache Lupu was sane? Like, what's in it for him, and what are his diagnostic criteria that allows him as a scientist to say there's actually nothing wrong with Petrache Lupu? After that, I turned to Vasilika Barbu, or Maica Veronica, from Mănăstirea Vladimirești, and I tell her story, and I think about what would it mean if Petrache Lupu was a woman? Like, how do female visionaries, how are they different to men? Then we have a chapter called The Root of All Evil, and this is about greed and the way that the money flowing into Maglavit is administered, and the fights between Father Bobbin, the priest, and the senator, the liberal senator from Maglavit, and then the involvement of Bishop Bartolomeo and the involvement of various political parties all trying to profit. Then the patriarch gets involved and the king. And then we move to an incredible source from 1940 when we show Petrache Lupu in brutal physical brawls with the monks there, because he can't stand them and they can't stand him. The final chapter is a tip of the hat to Lucrezio Petroscanu. It's called Under Four Dictatorships, and we take the story through the royal dictatorship, the National Legionary State, the Antonescu's dictatorship, and then what happens when the communists come in and they crush the monasteries, both at Maglavit and at Vladimirești, and they torture Petrache Lupu until he says it was all fraud. And just to come back to what Eugene just said about it, this stuff hasn't gone away. Let me read you the first paragraph of my epilogue. The miracle that eventually built Petrache Lupu's church happened far away on a cool evening in southwest Spain. The soccer team Fece Steaua București went into their second game of the 2005-06 UEFA Cup against Fece Real Betis Balompié after having tied 0-0 with them earlier in the competition. It was looking like this game would also end in a draw after a goalless first half, during which the Spanish team missed a couple of close attempts. But 8 minutes into the second half, the Romanian midfielder Bănel Nicolița took control of the ball 40 meters away from the goal and scored with a long-range shot into the right-hand corner of the net. A red card to Real Betis gave the Romanians the advantage, and his teammate Victoraș Iacob found the same corner of the goal in the 32nd minute, taking the score to 2-0 before Nicolița made it 3-0 4 minutes later, qualifying Steaua for the quarterfinals. At 2-0, I froze, Steaua's owner Gigi Becali said in the interview after the game. I thank God for this joy. I will build a church at Maglavit in honor of this victory. So really, we're still in the same world in many ways. And the book, for me, it raises a lot of questions about when people talk about religion, when someone like Becali talks about religion, what is he doing? And why is he using it that way? And why do people do or don't find that convincing?
Please, Joris Bancila from our institute and from Berlin, please.
Thank you. Can you briefly sketch the place of Maglavit in the history of a visionary religion in Greater Romania, also maybe in contact in relation to Enochiantism? So I'm currently under the spell of James Capello's book, and how would you relate the two? How if maybe they are part of the same religious history, And there is also a representative of some sort of catacomb church in Romania, Nil Dorobanzu, who also had maybe what was his role, maybe if you know what was his role in this history of visionary religion in Romania. Thank you.
Yeah. So James Capello, when he talks about Innocentism, he situates it within the context of late imperial Russia, the Russian Revolution, and then the building of the Romanian state. And he shows that you've got a lot of people very upset with the state of the church and the way that the church is being used as a tool of the state and being manipulated by the state. And they're like, this is not Christianity. And so Innocentism, in a sense, it's a revival movement. And you see a lot of revival movements in Romania in the 1920s. I think so. You see Innocentism, you have Old Calendarism, you have Cuibul Barza in Bucharest, you have Renașterea in Oltenia, and Renașterea it's led by Bishop Bartolomeu Stănescu, and you have to read that in the context of church building, because Romania starts off 1918 as multiple different churches, each of which has its own metropolitan, and then they all get combined into this one national church under Miron Cristea. And each of those former metropolitans and bishops, they've got this territory that used to be quite powerful, but is not anymore. And they want to get local people involved and use lay believers to show that their part of the church is more important than someone else's. And this I think is how I would read the creation of Oastia Domnului in Sibiu as well. And that's my last book that I wrote, called Sectarianism and Religious Reform in 1920s Romania. Where that intersects with Maglavit is you have old calendarists or stilists coming to Maglavit to find out what they think. Oastia Domnului loves Petrache Lupu, and people from Sibiu and București and other Oastia locations, they're constantly organizing pilgrimages, and when everyone else has forgotten Petrache Lupu, Oastia Domnului are still promoting him, because he talks about pocăința and he talks about personal religion in a way that the Orthodox Church in general is not particularly interested in, and is actually quite cynical about. And so I think that what you're seeing in Petrache Lupu, it's tied to the spread of lay pietism and lay involvement at a personal individual level through Bible reading and prayer and communal meetings and pilgrimage and singing that you're getting right across the country during the interwar period, which again I think has to be tied to the spread of democracy, the universal male suffrage, and increasing literacy rates.
Thank you so much. Perhaps one more question, if you would like to address. If Cristian Constantinescu, who happens to be a colleague, a philosopher from towards the end of the last century, but also a psychotherapist. And we do have a psychiatrist here. So all your public here is composed by historians, philologists, sociologists, and literary historians and theorists, but also a psychiatrist. So one more question, please.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you if you, of course you know, but if you mentioned or if you criticized the vision of Petrache Lupu through the Red Book of Jung, you know, who was also a seer of white-bearded old men. And he also was reluctant to communicate his Red Book. Of course, it was published by Sonu Shamdasani lately in a critical edition. So that's why I'm asking you if you saw it through this lens also. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. No, I didn't. And the reason why I didn't read him through Jung is because no one at the time did. People are reading him through quite a variety of lenses. For example, I have this this spiritualist in Craiova who wants to find out whether or not Petrache Lupu was real, and so he does a séance and he brings the spirit of Mihai Eminescu, who then tells him that Petrache Lupu is genuine. He's a greater spirit or something like this. But more importantly, I read it through the psychology of religion debates, and there's a lot of psychology of religion developing from the 1880s through to about early 1930s. Mate Yaga has a really brilliant book on this. And that's the lens through which people are reading Petrache Lupu. They're reading him through Freud, but not Jung. And more importantly, they're reading him through students of mass psychology and through questions about neurosis. So if people have hysteria and if people have, if they see visions, one of the where psychology was at in the 1930s, someone like George Marinescu, he's all about showing that you can find physical symptoms for mental problems. So if someone's crazy, their little finger will twitch in a certain way, or you should be able to tell by looking at someone what mental problems they're going to have by doing a physical exam of them. And this is one of the most interesting things I think that comes out of a close reading of Marinescu's work on Petrache Lupu.
Thank you so much once again. We are all very much looking forward to reading your forthcoming book. Thank you, dear Roland. And let's hope we will have also a published volume of this volume of proceedings of our meeting. And I am very happy that you joined us today, and we learned a lot, and we shall keep you posted about our activities. And when the book will be published, I do think you will immediately launch it together with your admirers and colleagues from the Institute for the History of Religions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.